everyone to the first Opus Instruments webinar. Hopefully it will be the first of many. It's an FAQ, Ask the Expert. So without further ado, I'll introduce myself. My name's Catherine Wilkinson, and I'm the Business Development Executive for Opus Instruments. So you may well have spoken to me if you've inquired about our cameras. And I go out on the road and demonstrate the camera and liaise with customers after sale. And then Andrew Kirby is our technical support manager, who has been with the company for many years. He is a physicist with a background of nearly 3 decades in scientific research, and has been involved importantly in early OSIRIS production. So hello, Andrew.
Hello, I'll try and assist you.
Okay, so we've got some commonly asked questions. We'll start with number 1. Where are we? Here we go. So a commonly asked question is, what is the purpose of the black filter on the front of the lens of both the OSIRIS and the Apollo cameras?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The idea is to make the camera easy to use. Some people are in a fortunate position where they can use the camera in a very dark environment, and in that case you wouldn't really need the black filter. So if you're fortunate enough to be in that position, then you can try to experiment and remove it. The idea is, if you're in a room that has a small amount of sunlight come in, that could cause a gradient in the image, because the image may take 10, 15, 20 minutes to record. Mm-hmm. And in that time, you might have varying levels of sunlight out into the room. So this black filter just crops off that annoying band of light that sits just between the dark red and the infrared region, so just in the visible. And that helps enormously in trying to give you a stable, uniform background. So, but as I say, you can experiment by removing it. So don't be afraid to. Okay, thank you, Andrew. So another commonly asked question is, can I use LED lights to illuminate my painting? And I think I know what the answer is, but if you'd like to explain. There are LED lights out there that will emit in the infrared, but they're kind of very specialist, more expensive, and they're not necessarily suitable for illuminating a large object such as a painting. What we would still recommend is you use conventional tungsten halogen lights that emit in the infrared. The problem with the domestic LED type bulbs that you might find is they are more energy efficient because they no longer emit heat, but that heat component is actually the infrared part. So if you just try and use one on its own, it will have a very poor infrared output. So at the moment, I would recommend that you use the conventional tungsten halogen bulbs. That may change in the future, but at the moment, that's probably the cheapest option. Yeah, sure. And I mean, they can be picked up from, quite readily from the internet. And I mean, you just want a pair, don't you, of tungsten halogens, dimmable, dimmable option. And, you've got a good lighting setup to go. I can see that Joey's already asked a question, but actually we'll go back to these questions at the end, if that's okay, and we'll put them together at the end. Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for the question, Joey. We will come to your question at the end. We won't miss you out. Thank you. Okay, so continuing with lighting, what is the best lighting setup and why? Well, I wouldn't get too hung up about the angle that you're illuminating with. If it's 45 degrees or 30 degrees away, then that's fine. As long as the infrared source is not a very small point source, it doesn't really matter. The most important thing is to get a good, even coverage over the object. Now, one thing that I see quite a lot of is where people are struggling to get enough illumination, they push the light source towards the object. Now that's okay, but if you position the light source in front of the lens, what will happen there is that you'll get direct infrared light passing its way back directly to the lens, which is what we don't want. We only want light that is being reflected from the object itself. So the problem is, if it goes directly from the infrared light source to the camera lens, then effectively you'll never ever get a true black in the image, because there'll always be some slight dark grey. So you'll lose some of your contrast. That's the reason I would suggest that you don't do that. You can still get a good image, but it won't be optimum. So that's probably the number one thing that I would raise at this point on that.
Yeah. I mean, it's not always possible, is it, either? It depends on what kind of space constraints you've got in your photography studio.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you've got to work with what you've got.
Yes, exactly.
But I mean, certainly, do you agree that that picture there would be ideal, would be fairly optimal?
It would, yeah. So, I mean, the spacing between the infrared lights is going to be roughly equivalent to the distance of the camera away from the object. It's not a precise thing. The main thing is not to get one side brighter than the other, because otherwise you'll get a gradient in the image. But it's a question of just playing with the camera. Once you've used it a few times, it'll be quite obvious. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. Next question. Yeah, this is a commonly asked question, isn't it? About the closest working distance you can put the camera lens, or the camera body, sorry, to the object or painting. And 90 centimetres is the minimum distance that we recommend. Why is that, and what would happen if I got the camera a little bit closer, say 70 or 80 centimetres to the object or painting?
Yeah, so this distance is measured from the back of the camera to the object. And it's the same distance that we use to calibrate the cameras.
Right.
This will give you the very best image, so it gets the best out of the sensor and the best out of the lens. If you try and move towards the object, say to 70 centimetres, you will then have to move the bellows to quite an extreme setting in order to focus the camera. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, because of the way the sensor scans behind the lens, so in this case, the sensor scans an area about the size of a postcard in order to recreate the image. What will happen is, if you push the lens too close towards the body of the camera, the sensor won't actually pick up much light in the corners of the image. So you'll get this horrible vignetting effect. So that is basically why we say, please don't go any closer than 90 centimetres. That is the optimum. Of course, many times you will want to actually work further away than that.
Yeah.
I know people who work, have the camera set several metres away just because they're more interested in being able to record the image at one pass rather than maybe stitching several images together.
Yeah. And of course, we've got the parameters calculator, which is downloadable from the website, which does all the thinking for you, which I find extremely helpful when I'm out on the road doing demos. And you can download that from the website.
Yeah, exactly.
Cuts out a lot of the guesswork, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Right. So moving on. Nice segue. Okay, so we've got the camera set up, we've got the lighting set up, we've got the distance between the camera and the object or painting optimum. Now, which F number should I choose? This is the first time I've opened up my Apollo box. I've set it up. What would you recommend as a first timer?
I would recommend that you set the lens to f8. The lens will have several different f-stops available. The problem is that very low f-stops will give you an incredibly bright image, which is very soft. And if you try and go all the way to f16, you'll need so much illumination,
right,
that you risk damaging the subject. So f8 is an excellent place to start, and that is where the cameras are calibrated. When you become a bit more confident, a bit more expert in using the camera, particularly the focus, then I would suggest that you move to f11. That will give you a slightly sharper image, which is definitely beneficial. But in moving from f8 to f11, you will have to double the intensity of your illumination. So that may not be suitable for all subjects. You have to, it's a compromise. But yeah, I would start at f8 and then move to f11 as you become more confident with the camera.
So am I right in thinking that if you move to f11 and you have to increase the light considerably or double it, then it's the heat incident that we're talking about? The heat
incident that, exactly. Yeah. So if you're dealing with a very valuable object that's hundreds of years old, the owner might not be very keen on you illuminating it so strongly. So it may not always be the wisest thing to do.
Sure. So maybe for a short scan, you know, a 2 or 3 minute scan, then it might be applicable. But if your scan's going to take 20 minutes, then there are all sorts of factors in play, aren't there?
Yeah, this will actually link in with Joey's question, which we'll address later.
Okay, we're nearly there, Joey. Okay, thanks, Andrew. So, we've got the macro lens. This is next. Okay, this is one of my favourite accessories. You can see here we've got the Apollo camera with the macro lens and illumination kit on the left, and an infrared reflectogram that I took last week to demonstrate this. So, in a nutshell, Andrew, what is the advantage of the macro lens, and what kind of detail can it gather, and maybe who might this be particularly useful for?
Yeah, well, it's really designed, its main purpose is designed for conservators who need to do repairs on damaged areas. Mm-hmm. So it's best used for imaging very small parts of the painting, roughly about the size of my hand or smaller. Yeah. And so if you've got a painting with a cut on it or some sort of, you know, damage that's occurred over the years, then the idea is to take a very, very high resolution image before you even begin to think about, you know, before you reason what you're going to do to try and mitigate the damage. That's the idea of this lens. It's not intended to be used to take, you know, very high resolution small areas that you then stitch together to produce a very high resolution overall image. That would just be unworkable. So it's really just designed at examining small areas.
I mean, what we can see in this infrared reflectogram, the picture on the right there is, I mean, if you look nice and closely, you can see the thread count there.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think the area of the painting that is showing is approximately sort of 4 centimeters squared. So you're getting a good level of detail there.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's one of my favourite pieces of the whole Opus setup.
Yeah.
And this macro lens will, if you're already an OSIRIS owner, it's exactly the same macro lens that we use on the Apollo, so that will transfer over. It's the same kit.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. So I've got the macro lens on the front of the camera, and when I can use the autofocus. So for instance, on the Apollo camera, I can move the lens assembly on the focus rods, which you can see there. I can move it backwards and forwards and do some fine focusing manually. But it's different with the macro lens, isn't it?
It certainly is. If you try and focus the image by moving the bellows, as you would normally with a macro lens, you won't get very far. In order to focus using the macro lens, you need to move the whole camera. So a good starting point is to have the camera roughly about 10 centimeters away from the object, and then move it either in or out by moving the tripod. For users who are going to do this a lot, I would suggest you think about obtaining a translation stage, which can either sit on the top of the tripod or your other imaging stage. And then it simply moves the whole camera in and out by just turning a wheel.
Yeah.
And it makes the whole process a lot less painful.
Yeah.
It's a kind of an unusual way of focusing, but again, it sounds more complicated than it is. Once you've done it a few times, it's relatively straightforward. Yeah,
it's certainly not a bit of kit to be daunted by. I was slightly daunted the first time I used it, but it's user friendly. So, and you get the image quality. It still blows me away.
Yeah, right. It's outstanding.
Okay, so moving on to really the big difference between the two cameras, the OSIRIS, the original camera from Opus Instruments, and the newer Apollo. The big difference, really, one of the big differences is the sensor that's involved. And the OSIRIS has a line array sensor, and the Apollo has an area sensor. In layman's terms, tell me all about those, and tell me what the advantages of the Apollos are, please.
So in the OSIRIS, you have a stack of 512 pixels that make up a vertical line, and then that scans over the image, each square, a bit like a photocopier does. So that then produces an image. It takes quite some time. In the Apollo, we have a different setup where we have an area sensor, so it's a two-dimensional system, and that has 128 by 128 pixels. So it's a small 2D sensor, but then what we do is to sample lots of small areas and stitch them all together. The main advantage is not actually whether one is 1D or one is 2D. The main advantage is that the Apollo sensor is cooled, has a built-in cooler. So in the OSIRIS, the camera is calibrated at the factory at lots of different temperatures.
Yeah.
But that is an approximation. We can't obviously calibrate the camera every single degree.
Yeah.
So what we end up with the OSIRIS is kind of a lookup table. The camera says, what temperature is it now? And then, oh, I need to apply this correction in order to remove any sort of hot pixels from the image. In the Apollo, you don't need to do that. The camera has a built-in cooler in the sensor, and then that is then held at a particular temperature, and so it never deviates far from that. So that gives us a lot less noise in the image. That's important because the dynamic range in the image is inversely proportional to how much noise we have in the system. So that's an important thing. That makes quite a big difference in the performance of the camera.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. That was a nice segue onto this slide.
Oh, yeah.
So what can we see here? So on the left-hand side, we have an image taken by the OSIRIS.
Yeah, so
on the right-hand side by the Apollo.
I mean, people bang on about how the improvement in the resolution between the two cameras. So the OSIRIS is a 16 megapixel camera, whereas the Apollo is a 26 megapixel camera. Mm-hmm. That, in my opinion, is a good feature to have, but it's not the most important feature. The OSIRIS is relatively limited in terms of the number of grey levels that it can reproduce. So the images aren't as contrasty. You never get proper dark blacks when you compare the two images. So the OSIRIS image looks kind of slightly washed out compared to the Apollo image on here.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because the OSIRIS image, as well as being uncooled, is only an 8-bit sensor. What does that mean? Well, if you take 2 to the power of 8, you end up with 256. So the OSIRIS camera is capable of displaying only 256 grey levels. If you now go to the Apollo, it has a 16-bit sensor. So if you take 2, raise that to the power of 16, you get over 65,000. So that's a colossal increase in the number of grey levels and the subtlety in which fine details in terms of grey level can be recorded. So you can see things like fine construction lines in the image much more clearly. They don't disappear into the background. So in my opinion, that is the biggest advantage of the camera.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is, being able to see those blacks in the Apollo picture really sort of brings it to life, doesn't it? And I imagine that detail can be very helpful to the conservator.
Yeah, it makes the images much more vivid.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, well, that wraps up our presentation, and we welcome your questions. So we have one from Joey Lee. Could you please kindly let us know whether 2 1,000-watt lamps are able to meet the requirements in most cases? So that's the tungsten halogen lamps.
Yes and no. 1,000 watts per, assuming you're going to have 2 lights. So you're then going to have 2,000 or 2 kilowatts of light over your painting or sample. That's far too much.
Okay.
Most of the time, I think the unit that I use is around 300 watts per side. So you don't really need a huge amount of illumination. It depends how far away you're going to be. But the problem with that is if you have 2,000 watt bulbs, then what will happen is you'll have to position the lights significantly further away from the camera, and they will then be behind you. So what will happen is as you try and move around to use the camera, you will cast a shadow on the painting. So effectively what you'll have to do is press go and then run away in order to make sure that you're not in the image yourself. So I would make sure that you're between probably something like 250 to 500 watts per side. I hope that helps.
Brilliant. I hope that answered your question, Joey. The next question from Jason is that we noted how close we can be to the painting, but how far away can one be whilst maintaining a high resolution image?
I've heard people of using these cameras in churches where they're actually looking at things on the wall, and they're several meters away. I mean, in practice, I can't see a good reason for being, maybe off the top of my head, maybe 20 meters away. I don't think any further than that would be, you wouldn't end up with a high resolution image. But there's a huge range. Most of the time, customers will be probably in the range of 2 to 3 meters away from the subject. I think that would cover the majority of cases.
Yeah, and I suppose it depends on how big your subject is as well.
Exactly. It really depends if you want to trade off resolution for the ability to move the camera away from the subject and capture it all in one pass. Yeah, that's easier to do with the Apollo because it's got inherently more pixels. Mm-hmm. You're obviously going to run out of resolution quicker with the OSIRIS. Yeah.
Okay, I hope that answered your question, Jason. A question from Guinevere. Okay, we have both the OSIRIS and the Apollo. Lucky you. Would there be a reason to still use the OSIRIS for certain projects? That's a good question that I've never heard before. So, Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, that is a good question, Guinevere. In my opinion, no. I can't think of a situation where the OSIRIS would be better suited for than the Apollo. They still both use the same lenses. They have a similar scanning mechanism. The sensor is the main difference, and of course the software. I can't think of a good reason where you would want to say, no, I don't want to use the Apollo, I want to go back to the OSIRIS. Mm-hmm. I mean, the OSIRIS is still an excellent camera for those who maybe can't quite stretch to the cost of the Apollo. But in all other respects, the Apollo is superior, and that is the way forward.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It'd be interesting to hear from you, Guinevere. If I hope I pronounced your name correctly, it'd be interesting to find out from you, perhaps, maybe not now, but whether you see any advantages of the OSIRIS over the Apollo as the end user. Okay, do we have any more questions? Oh, here we go. Here's one from Pedro. Hello, Pedro. Let's have a look. Is there an infrared arrangement applicable to IR? Because the thermal radiation of 1,000-watt bulbs are not interesting to more sensitive paintings, especially in transmission IR images.
So, is there an infrared arrangement? Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean. Obviously, in transmission IR, you're actually placing the camera on a different side to the bulbs.
Yeah.
And I've seen, for example, we looked at a painting for a customer where the actual most important bit was not the painting itself, but the fact that the painting had been reinforced over the years with some newspaper backings that dated back hundreds of years. Okay. And they had some quite interesting stories in there which confirmed the age of the painting. Okay. I'm not sure what you mean by the other part of your question.
Yeah, I mean, Pedro, I think we know who you are. We've been in correspondence, so if we haven't answered your question, ping it in an email, and we can certainly help you out with that answer.
Sure.
Separately. Any more questions? Okay, Guinevere, due to the circumstances working from home, I've not been able to make any images for months. Is that a problem for the camera's performance? Okay, so the camera hasn't been used for a long time. So would the camera need to be warmed up a little bit? Would you need to warm it up for longer, Andrew?
That's more of an issue with the OSIRIS camera, which has a lookup table to do its calibration. So right. Obviously, if the camera's been stored away in a cupboard that's very cold, that is not ideal, ordinary room temperature. But also, if the camera is very cold, I remember speaking to a customer in Russia, funnily enough. If it's very cold, then it won't find an applicable temperature that corresponds to its calibration. So the way around that is just to do a few test images and the camera will warm up. That's for the OSIRIS. For the Apollo, it doesn't really care. It will just, as long as you don't take it out in the snow, then the camera is quite happy. It should just, it should just be ready to go right from the beginning.
Okay, great. So you just need to do a couple of warm laps with the
OSIRIS. I mean, the camera sensor its performance won't change appreciably over time.
Yeah. Okay, I hope that answered your question. Any more for any more? I think we've answered all of them. We'll get back to you personally, Pedro, about your question, just to clarify. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for tuning in, everyone.
Yep.
If you have any questions, you know where to contact us. Contact at attic-cameras.com. You've got the web address there, all sorts of information on the website. Any more questions for future webinars, please let us know. Please help us with the content, because it's your webinar too. And hope everyone stays well and safe over the festive period.
Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.